Welcome, moms and dads. Welcome if you're as a grandparent, if you're a caregiver for a kiddo. Maybe you teach kiddos or you're a therapist and work with young kiddos. Either way, I'm excited to have you for our sensory and ADHD webinar today. And I know it can be a frustrating topic for a lot of parents at home. If your kiddo maybe they had a recent parent-teacher conference and it didn't turn out so well, you're getting calls or emails from the teacher. Maybe your kiddo struggles with not wanting to go to birthday parties or to the restaurant. Or maybe you do bring them there and you're afraid of a meltdown, a tantrum, or that they're going to be running around just causing chaos for everyone else. And if it is more on the sensory side, maybe it's your kiddo doesn't like getting dressed in the morning. Maybe they're irritated by loud sounds or bright lights. And not only can it be frustrating and heartbreaking as a parent for your kiddo when you see them struggling, but it can be really frustrating as a parent as well. I have a 3.5-year-old at home, and he goes to a nature preschool here in the Twin Cities. And just last week, I had him bundled in the appropriate amount of layers. It was a little colder than here in January in the Twin Cities. And as we were getting close to going out the door, he decided it'd be more appropriate to take all his clothes off. And once the layers started coming off, I felt so frustrated, a little bit angry because of the effort that I put in. And then all of a sudden, just like that, I see it go down the drain. So maybe you have a perfect morning routine you have laid out every day, and you say, okay, if we do this, our kiddo's going to get out the door. And you get really close, and all of a sudden they explode in a tantrum or a meltdown. And it just becomes frustrating as a parent too. So this webinar is something I'm super passionate about because it's something we love to help with in our office with the neurological approach that we take to chiropractic. And it's something that we find so many parents out there have done so much already, especially nowadays. Odds are, maybe you've tried gluten-free, dairy-free. You've eliminated red dye number 40. You've tried essential oils, and you feel like you've done it all. You've got all these resources and you're doing so much, yet it doesn't seem to be making the impact that you hoped it would. One of the reasons we're combining this webinar with both sensory and ADHD together is that we see there's often an overlap in the kiddos that we see in our office. So I want to share a quick story of a fifth grader that we started working with last fall. So he came into us, and when he started out, he was officially diagnosed with ADHD. And math and reading were his biggest struggles. He was falling behind. And when I asked him, so tell me more, what's going on? He said, well, when I'm in class, if we have, say, a breakout session in little groups, and we're supposed to be working with our group, I can't help but overhearing what's going on in the other groups. I have to check it out. Or if maybe the teacher is teaching us and a kid next to me starts tapping their pencil, or I hear the furnace kick on, all those things, my brain, as soon as it hears it, I have to look and see what's going on. And as we started talking, I thought, oh, okay, well, it sounds like your brain is actually having a trouble processing the auditory side of things, the sound that is coming in. So I think if we help your brain process that better, you're going to do really well. The other thing Mom mentioned is, we also notice when we travel, he gets this nervous stomach and he'll have these random episodes of throwing up. And in the fall, he's on a traveling soccer team, so we're out of town most weekends. So start adjusting him, fast forward. We do a progress check-in in 6 weeks, and Mom's filling out on the form. Suddenly, he's got a newfound love for math, newfound love for reading. He recently got an A+ on a math test. I start asking Mom, okay, it sounds like he is doing better in school. His brain's able to focus and pay attention better. How's his nervous stomach? And she's reflecting, oh yeah, come to think of it, the last few weekends we've traveled out of town, no throwing up. One more week goes by, and he comes in the office. He goes, Dr. Ty, guess what? I just got moved up a level in math class because his brain was doing better. And this is a perfect example where his diagnosis was one thing, but as we started looking deeper, we actually found it was more of a sensory processing issue. that sound was coming in too noisy for his brain, and as a result, he couldn't pay attention. So, as we helped his brain process the sensory input better, all of a sudden that diagnosis of ADHD started to fade away. Now, if you're watching this and you're a practice member in our office, welcome. And if you're watching this and you've maybe don't see a chiropractor or have never seen one, you're wondering, like, wait a minute, why is a neurological based chiropractor talking about sensory and ADHD? And the reason I'm here today is because our office really specializes in the nervous system and how the brain is not only processing information, but is it receiving information that is calm and organized? Or is it receiving information that is chaotic and disorganized and stressful for the brain? As a result, our office is 40 to 45% pediatric because of our expertise in this area and what we love helping out with. So the three things we're going to focus on today. Number one is the brain's top priority in order to sit still, in order to pay attention, in order to get good grades, to learn, to be able to handle a birthday party or an outing at a restaurant, or to put clothes on in the morning. All those things have to do with, does the brain feel safe? Number two, we're going to talk about then, is there stress or is there calm and organization going into the brain? And we're going to talk about a couple senses here that come from the body that I find are the most overlooked as parents are looking for resources to help their kiddo. And number three, probably one of the most important things, is how then, if my child's brain is feeling stressed and feeling overwhelmed, how do we activate the brake pedal? This is also known as the vagus nerve. It's something that's getting a lot of traction, a lot of attention in healthcare because of how powerful it is to help the body and the brain do better in life, basically. So I want to start with then priority number one is the brain's goal is to take in information, all the sensory information, in order to interact with the world around us. Step one is feeling safe. You've probably heard the example. If you're getting chased by a tiger, you don't care about multiplication or did you take the garbage out, right? In that moment, safety is the top priority. You've experienced this yourself. If you're looking at the time and you're saying, school starts in 20 minutes and we've got to get out the door. I've got a work meeting starting here, and you're scrambling and racing and your heart starts beating a little faster. You're going into that fight flight mode yourself and trying to get the kiddos out the door, and that becomes the top priority, is getting them to school on time or you to work on time. As a result, you might leave the house a little messy. You don't care about the dishes in the sink at that time because your brain is in this stress mode for a certain outcome. So our brain brings in information from the main five senses that we all learn in school. The sound I just mentioned. Sight is bringing in information here. If your kiddo has a sensory processing issue, it might be bright lights or flickers that can be very distracting. As an example, my wife has astigmatism in one of her eyes, so if she's driving at night, she might be driving the car and I'm in the passenger seat or vice versa, and headlights will come at her a certain way and she feels like the car is veering into her lane even though it really isn't. And guess what she does if she thinks the car is about to hit her or pull into our lane? There's a gasp, there's a startle, there's a response, and it's a perfect example of her brain going into that fight flight mode because it doesn't feel safe because it thinks we're about to have a crash. Taste and smell often go together. If your kiddo here, you might notice they're a really picky eater, or they might smell kind of floats through the room and most people are like, no big deal, and your kiddo just can't stand it. Textures can be a common thing when it comes to the picky eater. Maybe they only like mushy or they really like crunchy. So those two. And then the fifth one that we learn about is the touch. It's the tactile sense. So as an example here, we had a mom bring her teenage kid in to see us that had a lot of sensory issues. But mom said, you know what? As a kid, I remember the first time my kiddo's feet touched the grass, she burst out crying. It felt like her feet were on fire, and I felt so bad for her so early on. This tactile sense could be maybe the tag of a clothes, of a shirt bothers your kiddo, or they need the seams lined up on their socks just perfect. Nowadays, a lot of kids will say, I don't want to wear jeans. Partly they're a little tighter, not as comfortable. But if your kiddo just needs that flexible seam or something that moves easy with their body, that's an example of the tactile sense. Maybe your kiddo has their favorite sweatshirt and favorite pair of sweatpants, and that's all they wear all the time. One of the reasons is because if they have a touch or a tactile issue, if they try a new piece of clothing, it might stress their brain out and cause it to not feel safe. Feeling safe is often a reason why your kiddo might not want to go to a party or somewhere new, because anything new or unexpected, they're not sure, is it going to overwhelm their brain? They might walk into that birthday party and there's noise and there's streamers and there's balloons and there's all this activity that it can overwhelm their brain more easily. We're going to go over these two body senses here in a little bit when we get to number 2. But the overall goal then is to look at, when your brain's receiving information, how is it handling it? How is it processing it? Because what happens is, if your brain starts to become overwhelmed by the world, it's going to tell the body to respond in a stressful way. So often, families come to see us, or you go to OT, or you're getting that call from the teacher because there's some sort of symptom happening. So maybe your kiddo feels afraid instead of safe. Maybe they're super hyper in class instead of being calm. They're distracted instead of focused. They tend to have overwhelming behavior, meltdown tantrums a lot easier than just flowing and moving through the world with ease. And maybe they're super stubborn, they're defiant, they are controlling instead of cooperative. All these are indications that there's something overwhelming their brain. And when families come to see us, what makes us unique and different is that instead of saying, all right, let me figure out the symptoms and give you the right diagnosis, maybe they're having trouble focusing and they're really hyper, and we're going to diagnose them with ADHD. You have a certain survey you fill out as a parent, and if you make so many check marks of a symptom, you get a certain diagnosis. Maybe the teacher says, you know what? I see them daydreaming a lot. They just don't pay attention, but they sit really still. So maybe it's ADD instead. All the things I just talked about here in the sensory realm, there can be a huge checklist of activities of daily living that might be impacted. And the more check marks you have, the more likely they are to get that diagnosis. So what we want to do today, and what we focus on then, is actually taking a step back from the diagnosis. And we recognize that if these different symptoms are happening, it's a sign that their brain is telling their body to wiggle in class, to be stressed. So the question is, why is the brain telling the body to do that in the first place? And that's why we're backing up and going into this realm here. Just like I mentioned with the 5th grader early on, is he wasn't focused, but it actually came back to here how his brain was processing sound. I'm going to share, if you were to Google, do a search for foundations of learning or pyramid of learning, you'll get this graphic here. And what I want to emphasize is what we're going to then go into next on these two senses from the body. So step 1 is seeing how those 5 senses we learn about in school are doing. And if they're allowing the brain to feel safe, you can check them off and go to the next step. So what happens then is, as a parent, you might say, okay, well, I've got my kid. If I notice there's sensitivities here, I will have them do certain things. As an example, I was just talking to my wife, and a colleague of hers, what she does is she works at a school in a special room that if a kid has ADHD and they need to take a test, they get pulled and put in that room because they can control the environment. They can limit the amount of sounds. Maybe there's a visual sensitivity, and so the fluorescent lights are distracting, or Again, they see a kid moving or wiggling and they get so distracted by it, so they can limit the environment to try to help their brain do better when they're taking a test. Now, what happens is if you find certain triggers in the environment and you've eliminated them and you said, yep, if we can control this in the environment, my kiddo does pretty well, that is a sign that, yeah, it's probably coming from here. What you might find is you limit the environment really well, but your kiddo still is getting stressed. They're still distracted. They're still having meltdowns. They're still defiant. You're thinking, wait a minute, I thought one of those things was it. Well, then we want to look inside the body. So these next two senses are what come from the body into the brain, regardless of what's going on in the rest of the class or at daycare or in the surroundings. So number one is where we'll spend the most time today. It's proprioception. And what this one is it comes from the little muscles and little joints, and it tells the brain where the body is at in space. Proprioception you'll probably recognize with something like a weighted blanket. If you put a weighted blanket on, it compresses all those little joints and those little muscles, and it sends information to the brain to let the brain know, hey, we're safe. So proprioception is typically one of the most calming, one of the most soothing inputs for a kiddo's brain to help them calm and regulate. As an example, at home, if we need to have our son burn off some energy before bed, we might be rolling and tumbling and kind of roughhousing, and we feel his energy ramping up, and we'll take just a moment, maybe it's 30 seconds, a minute, and we'll do some hugs and some squeezes and kind of compress his body. Maybe we'll roll on the ground with him. And what happens is his energy, we see it ramping up and it's almost going to become dysregulated and spin out of control. And so we use proprioception, that deep bear hug, that squeeze, that squish, to bring him back down because it's very regulating for the brain. If there is a touch or a tactile sensitivity, you might have a kiddo that, as say they are being touched for a hug or a blanket, their brain starts to freak out and they say they don't like it. That is often because it's actually sense is overwhelming their brain more than this sense is. We had a girl 9 years old, and when her brothers and mom started care, I'd be adjusting the brothers and I'd look over on the chair, and mom and daughter would always be separate because mom said when she started her daughter for care that she doesn't like to be touched without knowing why. And she, as a result, was not very emotional. Like, she wouldn't say I love you, even though it was a super warm family. And you could see this separation, not because she disliked her mom, but because she didn't like to be touched. So we started adjusting her, and as we're doing our progress assessment, mom's like, hey, guess what? I'm starting to be able to give her hugs. I can comb her hair now. I can put lotion on her. All these things aren't irritating her brain. And I remember they had moved to Belgium where her dad got a new job. And one of the last visits they were in, I'm adjusting the brothers, and I look up in the chair, and daughter's sitting in mom's lap, and mom's just brushing her hair, and they're cuddling and snuggling. And it's so heartwarming because now her daughter could take that information in a more organized way and feel calm from it instead of stressed by it. So proprioception. And then the other body sense comes from the inner ear. This is the vestibular sense. It helps our brain recognize, are we in motion or are we sitting still? This would be if you don't like to go on roller coasters. You get dizzy and nauseous. Maybe you get car sick really easy. It can be in this vestibular realm. This is also very calming and organizing for the brain if it happens in a good way. So if your kiddo doesn't do well with this, that's where it can kind of create that car sickness or nauseous feeling, and they don't want to be moving. If your kiddo really craves it, they might love the swing set on the playground. They might love the merry-go-round or something that's spinning and moving them, because that is putting this craved information into their brain. So they say, I'm going to get it at all costs. Remember last summer, my son went through a stretch where we could put him on the swing set and he would just swing for like 15, 20 minutes because his brain is still developing, it's still learning, it's still integrating this information, and he just wanted more and more and more of it. Or there's this a little disc with a handle and you sit on it and you spin circles, and he again could do that for a really long time because as his brain was developing, it was really, really craving this vestibular input. So now what happens is if these are off, they can be very stressful for the brain. So before I go into that next piece, I wanted to come back to this pyramid here that I mentioned earlier. The reason that I really want to emphasize these, along with the whole sensory system, is that at the top of this pyramid is where kiddos typically come to see us or get, it's kind of in this category here. There's some sort of symptom happening. So I know it's going to be a little bit off, but I'll put in front of the camera here. We've got learning, activities of daily living, and behavior. Those are at the very top. Below that, we have things like speech, fine motor, gross motor, coordination, and those infant milestones, rolling, sitting, crawling, walking. But at the very top, when we have learning, activities of daily living, behavior, basically that means, can your child learn in class? Can they sit still? Can they pay attention? Can they get through the day in a way that other classmates are able to do? At the bottom then, that's what we want our kids to do. But if we go to the very bottom, you can see here vestibular, proprioception, tactile, and then the other senses here. So the whole sensory system is the foundation of that pyramid. So again, if you Google foundations for learning, foundations for learning pyramid, you're going to see the sensory system is at the very base, because step one is the brain has to be able to take in information from the environment, feel safe from it, then it can take a deep breath, feel grounded, sit still, relaxed, and now engage with the environment and move forward and up that pyramid. So if stress is going into the brain, guess what? It cuts that whole pyramid off because it's saying, well, we're feeling stress, we have to interact in a stressful way. We're going to go into that fight-flight response, and now you're going to start to get some of these concerns and these struggles. What we focus on in our office is actually a combination of these, but especially proprioception. So where proprioception, where the most comes from, as I mentioned, it comes from the little muscles, little joints in our body. So the most concentrated area of those is, you guessed it, the spine. Because it's a little vertebrae, meaning little muscles, little joints, all the way down the spine. Some seminars I've been at, they estimate 60% of the proprioception comes from the spine. A third of it alone comes from the upper neck. So what happens is, if this is off, it starts to lose out on good proprioception into the brain, and it actually starts to send stress into the brain. There is another term you don't need to worry about, but if you want the technical term, nociception, is when something's off and not moving well, instead of sending calm into the brain, it sends stress into the brain. I like to think of it as Metallica. So if the part of the spine is off and it's stuck and it's not moving well, it might not be painful, but it's going to start to stress the brain out from inside the body. This is one of the most common things that we see in kiddos who are really struggling and just not progressing. Maybe you started OT and you've been there for 6 months or a year and you're like, I think I see a little change. Or you saw some change and then they plateaued. Or, as I mentioned earlier, you've done everything environmentally that you can, but your kiddo's still struggling. Odds are there's something off inside their body that is going to send stress into the brain. And what happens, as stress is going into the brain, it starts to then disorganize the brain, because the brain, when it's in fight or flight mode, it doesn't have long-term memory or attention or learning as a priority. So it starts to become disorganized and confused. and not able to get through the day the way we want our kiddos to do. So I'm going to give you an example here. Let's do. This is a 7-year-old boy that came to see us. And one of the things we do to measure is this proprioceptive system, is something from the spine off, stressing out the brain? Are these neurological scans? And in his case, he's got a double whammy here. I'm going to explain when we move into point 3 here next with activating the brake pedal and the vagus nerve. But ultimately on these scans, we want to see the white bars. If we see green, blue, or red is the worst, red is severe, that gives us an indication that something's off in the spine and it's going to be stressing the brain out. So this 7-year-old boy diagnosed with ADHD when he was in the beginning of the school year. I've got my notes here so I can remember to say it accurately, but parents said the teachers are reporting like he could sit still for 20 seconds. The school did an eval and diagnosed him with extreme ADHD, had really trouble falling asleep at night. There's a couple other things immune system wise that this upper neck affects, and I'm just going to mention this because it might relate to you. In this boy's case, he had a lot of ear infections as a kiddo. He ended up having sleep apnea because his tonsils were swollen, so they had to remove those, and he got sick really often, frequent colds and pneumonia, so his immune system was affected a lot as well. Ultimately, when he started seeing us, he was in this situation. They also, each day, they'd have this little graph that they'd have to fill out, like, did you stand in line? Did you sharpen your pencil? Did you help out emptying the garbage? And a little chart to keep their brain on track and organized with what the teachers wanted to get done for the day. And the teacher said initially he would have 1 or 2 of all these check boxes filled out. So we start adjusting him, and you can see this is a follow-up 2 months later. Way better up top there, and I'll explain why that's important here in a moment. But right away, parents noticed better sleep. He was calmer, so his brain could start to shut off at the end of the day. Sick a lot less often. He started digesting food better, breathing better. But the teachers, the biggest thing here, started to report he was more alert. He's able to focus better. The form that I mentioned, suddenly he was having it 90%, 100% filled out at the end of the day. And a couple months into school, they retested him, and he went from extreme ADHD to barely qualifying as ADHD. And the cool thing is that's in 2 months' time for a kiddo that's 7 years old and has had these stress patterns going on for quite a while. So the reason this was working was twofold. Number one, we started to activate proprioception. Areas that used to be sending stress and distraction into his brain. By the gentle neurological adjusting, we started to put proprioception and calm into his brain. So as that calm from his body went into his brain, he could be in the exact same environment that he was always in, but do way better because his brain was receiving calm from his body. The second major thing that happened with him is, I'm going to transition us into point number 3 here. So point number 3 is the brake pedal. Now, so far we've talked a lot about, is the brain feeling stress from the environment? Are things in the external world triggering that fight-flight response and causing the brain to go into fight-flight and sound the alarms and create this list of things going on? Well, the other major factor when it comes to helping your kiddo, whether it is a sensory issue or whether it is ADHD or a combination of both, is can they activate the brake pedal side of the nervous system? So when you're driving your car, you put your foot on the gas, that means go, accelerate, get everything going. The second piece is, can you put your foot on the brake? Because that calms and slows the car down. Now, we need both. We need a gas pedal in our body. This is the fight or flight response. This is needed if we're doing a workout, if we have a deadline at work, if we need to get through a stressful moment. But we also have to come down from that with the brake pedal. This is where the vagus nerve comes in. The vagus nerve is what calms and slows things down. So if you're driving your car, and imagine if your brake lines are shot, you're coming up to the stoplight, you know you should slow down, so you put your foot on the brake, but your car keeps going. That's the challenge that we see with a lot of kiddos, is they're good kiddos. They don't want to have a tantrum that lasts an hour or 90 minutes. They don't want to be called out in front of their classmates and get bad grades and be sent to the principal's office. They don't want to have their brain feeling overwhelmed. They're good kiddos. And they try to put their foot on the brake, but guess what? Their car just keeps going. So the brake pedal in our body, the major one is the vagus nerve. This is about 75% of the braking system for our nervous system. So whenever we do start to feel stressed, that vagus nerve, that brake pedal, is what brings us back down to help calm and regulate our brain. It comes from the upper neck. So if we look here, I highlighted, it's this nerve in green and it's got the yellow highlights. It goes all the way down through the body. And one of the critical things is there used to be a lot of emphasis on the vagus nerve regulating the body. It goes to the heart, it goes to the lungs, the stomach, the intestine. So if your vagus nerve is off, you might have breathing problems. You might, more commonly as an adult, have high blood pressure. You might have digestion being off, or you get stomach aches or constipation, diarrhea. Vagus nerve regulates the immune system. That's why I mentioned with this 7-year-old boy before, he was getting sick all the time. And so it used to be the focus that, yep, the vagus nerve regulates the body. So if fight flight happens, guess what? All the resources that should be running the body go out to the muscles of the arms and the legs, because fight flight means take action. That stress response pulls things from our digestion and our immune system, pulls the energy, pulls the blood to take action. So if a kiddo's chronically in fight flight, you might notice some of those other things as well, whether it is their immune system, their digestion, they don't sleep at night. All those are little clues that their nervous system is dysregulated. Again, a more common term that's gaining some traction is dysautonomia. That means their nervous system is out of balance and it's chronically stuck in that stress mode. So in that graph that I just showed you, the vagus nerve comes from the upper neck. So not only was he getting stress from his body into his brain, but I mentioned that double whammy is because his neck was off, now his vagus nerve couldn't activate as the brake. So once we got the braking system going, it allowed things to start to come down and regulate. Other strategies that you can use to activate the vagus nerve, because it comes from the brainstem, you might have heard of things like singing or humming or gargling. Anything activating that vibration in this area is something that helps the vagus nerve. Things like meditation, calming, even things like spinning if your kiddo likes it. Autistic kiddos, you might see like flapping their hands or having a certain tick or a stomp or a move. That type of movement in their body is often activating these proprioception vestibular senses to actually activate the vagus nerve and calm the vagus nerve. One of the other most critical pieces actually for the vagus nerve is in the realm of socializing and interacting with others. So I mentioned the vagus nerve controlling the body. Now the more recent traction the vagus nerve has been getting is because it helps to calm the nervous system, is looking beyond just the body piece, but the brain as well. And now we realize that the vagus nerve is actually critical for socializing. It allows our brain to look at facial expressions to help match if someone's saying words like, I'm angry right now, but it doesn't match their facial expression. The vagus nerve is like, that sounds kind of fishy. So it matches the words with the facial expressions, and to see how to communicate with someone, to assess their body language. Dr. Stephen Porges founded the polyvagal theory, which is where a lot of this comes from. And so what can happen is if your kiddo's under chronic stress, they can initially they hit that fight flight response. But what happens is if the fight flight becomes so extreme that they become immobilized, they can't decide, should I fight, should I flight? They go into the next deeper mode of stress called the freeze response. This is where they just get stuck there. This is myself as a kiddo in my teenage years, junior high and high school, just so nervous and overwhelmed with the classmates and the school and everything going on that I would go into that freeze mode. Just kind of sit there and smile. The cool thing is when we socialize, when we interact with others in a safe way, so not a bully standing over you on the playground, but in a safe way, it actually helps to get the vagus nerve back online and get us out of that freeze mode. So socializing is super important to help our kiddos activate the vagus nerve and start to get, in a sense, out of their shell. There's also studies that show that if your kiddo has a sensory processing issue, that it often has to do with the vagus nerve. They've taken groups of kiddos and they, like as an example, a group with no sensory issues, a group with medium, and a group with high sensory issues. And they measure how well their vagus nerve is doing. The kiddos with no sensory issues, typically their vagus nerve is doing really well. Medium and moderate, their vagus nerve increasingly is off. So the poorer the vagus nerve is functioning, the less ability the brain has to process sensory information. If it's not processing it well, more likely that this sensory information going into the brain is going to cause the brain to tell the body to be stressed and overwhelmed. So one of the most critical areas that we see in our office over and over again is that vagus nerve. I'll share one more story here along the same lines. So this girl was dealing with sensory issues instead of ADHD. And you can see her initial scans, a lot going on up top, a lot in the middle there. So in her case, at 7 years old, she wouldn't wear socks. She'd only wear shoes or clothes that are a size or two too big. Her category was this tactile, this touch sensation. She wouldn't put lotions on her hands, so in the winter her hands would get chapped and raw. And overall, because of this stress and tension in her body, she was a lot more nervous than parents wanted her to be. So we start adjusting her. Immediately, mom and dad notice she's feeling a lot more calmer. They can sense this groundedness coming into her. A couple weeks into care, and I'm adjusting her, and I look down, and I'm like, hey, wait a minute. You've got socks on today. She looks at me, she's like, yeah, I slept with them on last night. No big deal. Okay, well, that's a good sign. And then 2 months in, mom reports she's now getting dressed and she's wearing socks without fighting. She's wearing clothes that used to feel icky. The clothes that were the normal size for her in the past felt icky because they irritated her body. Now she was wearing them just fine. So you can see the follow-up scan that we did here. Again, this was more a month and a half, almost 2 months apart. Where this big clump here, it's dissipating, still a little bit to do. You can see some old stresses coming to the surface. And the cool thing is we know, like, all right, we still have work to do, but clearly she's getting better. Her body's doing so much better. And the nice thing about these scans is not only can we assess what's going on in the body, but we can assess as kiddos are going through care, the progress that they're making and what we have left to do to really get them all the way better. If you're curious, we have a thermal scan that's measuring temperature along the side, each side of the spine. That one was based on research at Johns Hopkins that found if the temperature's off, when they trace that nerve around, that body part was malfunctioning. And then we have an EMG scan, which measures how much energy is going through each layer of the spine. And as a result, it's basically measuring if there's a lot of energy, a lot of stress, especially if it's twisted or turned, it's sending a lot of stress into the brain from the body. All the scans that we do are super safe, super gentle. We do them on pregnant moms. We do them on newborns. I scan my son consistently. So something that we can do for any age. So as we start to wrap up here, the last question parents often have is, okay, that all makes sense, but out of curiosity, like, where did it come from? Where did it start? And if we go back then, one of the things we love is as we're assessing a kiddo is actually sitting down with mom or dad and talking about their history. How stressful was pregnancy? Was it easy to conceive? Was there a lot of stress going on? That as baby's nervous system is getting wired, was mom under a lot of stress? And that can actually transfer stress to the baby, whether, obviously it's not something we hope for, but it can happen. When my wife was pregnant with our son, she had to train some people in for her business so she could take time off. So she was working around the clock. At 34 weeks, she fell and broke her ankle. She needed a surgery that took 2 plates and 9 pins to repair her ankle. So clearly an amount of stress we weren't hoping for. When labor and delivery does come, in my wife's example, because she was on a knee roller for the last 5 weeks and things started to shift, it took a lot longer than we were anticipating. So a 30-hour labor, my son's head was not quite moving through as easy as we wanted it. So when he was born, his head bones were overlapped way more than most babies that I see that I've checked. There was a little nick of a fracture in his collarbone and lots of stress that he had to undergo being born. Just this week, talked to yesterday morning actually, a 5-week-old who was going through labor, and once mom dilated to 7 centimeters, they looked and realized, wait a minute, that's not his head, that's his butt, he's breech. They had to do an emergency C-section. Whether it's a kiddo, checked older kiddos who mom said, yep, each contraction, instead of baby's head going through the pelvis, head was in the pelvis, and each contraction was putting that pressure on little baby's head and neck. For myself, I was born with forceps and got pulled out that way. So there's lots that can happen in the birth process. Even if it went relatively smooth, it can be a lot of strain on baby's neck. Even one mom we were talking to recently, and she's like, yeah, I just, it felt like really smooth. And then a few days later, she's like, oh, I was talking to my husband, and he reminded me, actually, our daughter's hand was stuck up by her head, and each contraction actually was decelerating her heart rate. Sometimes we see the cord around the neck. So there's lots of examples where even something relatively smooth that the OB or the doctor doesn't comment on can actually throw their neck off. There's a medical doctor out of Germany that did a study on 100 babies and found that 80% of them had some sort of misalignment in the neck or the head after birth alone. If we fast forward a little bit, being a toddler, learning how to walk, learning how to crawl, getting bumps and bruises. There was a 3-year-old daughter, mom brought her 3-year-old daughter to see us, and she said, up to 1-year-old, she was great. Suddenly she fell and she got stitches in her chin. And literally after that, she became grumpy and ornery and just not herself. And as we did our scans, we found something was off there actually from that fall that was sending stress into her brain. Started adjusting her, and now that lasts from year 1 to year 3, grumpy ornery, suddenly she got to be back to herself and calm and relaxed. So just the tumbles and being a kiddo can add up in those early years. Then if we start to add now school and interacting with others, your immune system's getting training, you're trying to learn how to socialize and interact with others. If the vagus nerve has been under stress already, now it can add even a little bit more stress. If we go back, maybe if you're infant, if you notice that they were colicky or refluxy, or maybe their head was turned to one side more than another, maybe they needed a helmet because their head bones were really misshapen. Those are all signs too that there was a stress early on. And when we look again at the nervous system, I mentioned earlier, the nervous system's job is also to control the body. So if your kiddo is chronically constipated, if they catch every cold, or when they do get a cold, it just lasts for weeks on end. If as a youngster they had a lot of ear infections, if something's off in the neck, it can prevent the fluid from the ears from draining. So commonly we'll see lots of ear infections. So there's all these little clues we start to put together when we talk with parents to say, guess what? I think some of this stress that you're experiencing now at 7 years old, 10 years old, 15 years old, it actually came from earlier on. And the scans help us see if it is still stuck in the body, exactly where it's at and how deep it is. So that's what we do when we help parents really get to the root of their kiddo's sensory or ADHD issues, is we put on our investigator hat, we do our scans, we put all that information together to know if we can help out. So if you don't see a neurologically based chiropractor, I definitely recommend checking one out. If you're not in the Twin Cities, shoot us a message, and we have some databases and resources and colleagues that we know of throughout the country. I know there was someone registered for this webinar from Puerto Rico, so we can look for you there too if you're interested. And if you are in the Twin Cities, we'd love to take a look. On that first visit, as I mentioned, we do our scans to get our baseline, we gather all that information, and then on the second visit is when we go over, based on what we found, what does a care plan look like. And as a parent, then you have all the information to know to get your kiddo started if it feels like a good fit, because on that second visit we say, hey, here's what we found, can we help? If we can help, what's it going to take, what's it going to cost? You have all the information you need to feel confident in your decision to move forward. So as we wrap up today, I want to thank you very much for joining us and joining myself, and really appreciate the time that you've taken to look into why your kiddo is struggling. And hopefully this provided some new insights for you to really understand your child in a better way, and understand that they're not trying to misbehave or be mean or act out. It's often that there's just something stuck in their body that's stressing their brain, that if you can help them uncover that and clear that out, start to put calm, put organization into their brain from their body, you can really see your kiddo thrive and succeed in a whole new way. And we're happy to support you on that journey. I'll talk to you soon.